Thanks for coming. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this, it's already a fascinating symposium. I'm going to be talking to you about humans and the human brain and how it is that we represent tools and related objects in our brains. And I don't have to convince you that we are surrounded all the time, every day, by really a vast array of these things we call tools, which really kind of underscores and highlights the tremendous creativity and flexibility of our cognitive system. So the goal that I set for myself today is to kind of review for you what we've learned about how this category of objects, that is, tools, are represented in the human brain. And most of the data that I'm going to talk about comes from putting people into MRI scanners like this one right here, where we can get information not only about the structure of the brain, but also about functionality. And let me just give you the bottom line of my talk. This is the take-home message in case I never get to the end or you fall asleep. So it's really this, that every aspect of tool cognition, from our ability to create them to the knowledge we store about their appearance, function, and use, is dependent on a domain-specific neural system that is part of the basic intrinsic architecture of the human brain. This is the stuff that we all carry around, and what Nikki's children were starting to use and utilize in part to do the problem solving that she just showed us. So the way we've gone about doing this over the years in my laboratory is really to pit one kind of knowledge domain against another, and in particular, looking at animate things, animate entities. Those are living things that move on their own, like us, four-legged animals and so on, versus inanimate objects, and with the best examples being animals versus tools. And later on, I'll show you some evidence of more higher order levels of cognition, relatedly social knowledge versus mechanical knowledge. And this notion of looking at animals versus tools is not really an arbitrary choice at all. These are the basic object categories that patients with focal lesions tell us to pay attention to, because these are the most common knowledge, domain-specific knowledge disorders that can occur after brain injury. And this is just evidence from a review we did a while ago. This is starting from the modern era that Elizabeth Warrington first started to present these patients in the early 80s, up to the next 18 or so years when we compiled this, where there were already about 150 of these so-called patients in the literature. And as you notice, there's an asymmetry with many more of these patients with difficulties with animals versus tools, but I'll return to that in a little while. So what's with these patients? Well, one of the things is that they have difficulty naming objects with this particular domain of tools. So for example, shown a picture like this, one of my patients said, well, it's a thermometer. Does anybody remember what this thing actually is? So even if you didn't remember it was a protractor, I doubt you would have said thermometer. You would have said some other description. Here's another example, patient confronted with this picture, and he said to me, I know that thing, you hang your clothes on it. And I said, yeah, that's right, you hang your clothes on it. He never got there, had the verb form but not the noun form. Okay, so very specific to these nouns and very specific to this domain versus others. And the other interesting thing about these patients is it's not simply the name that they have difficulty, but they seem to have lost all kinds of knowledge about these objects. So, for example, not only did they know what to call it, but they would have difficulty with simple yes-no questions like this. Is it used to hold things? Is it used to cut things? Does it have moving parts? This focus on properties of objects, the kinds of properties that define our conceptual knowledge of these objects, is really important because both the patient data and our imaging data, which I'll show you a little of in a moment, has really stressed that the critical features of understanding how knowledge is organized is really about these properties. And it's led to this general principle, which I'll read for you right now, and that is that the information about the salient, the most prototypical properties of the objects that we confront in the world, such as what they look like, how they move, and how we use them, as well as our affective responses to them, are stored in our perception, action, and emotion systems. The latest version of this model I'm calling GRAPES, which stands for Grounding Representations in Action, Perception, and Emotion Systems. So that kind of theoretical overview has just been published for those of you who might be interested in more detail. All right, so let me walk you through this. This is a cartoon of the human brain. That's the lateral surface. Just make sure you see this. That's the lateral surface of the left hemisphere. Here is what's called the ventral surface. So imagine just taking this hunk, this is the temporal lobe, occipital lobe, kind of ripping it out, turning it upside down to show you the bottom, that is the underneath surface. And we're talking about, I'm going to be referring to these areas that I've painted in blue. All right? And on the ventral surface, this area right here is really where we store information about the form of objects. And the blue area is not just the form of any object, but the form of the objects we're focusing on, and that is tools relative to, for example, this, I keep losing my pointer here, this red area that's really about representation of animate things, including faces, our bodies, and so on. And along this lateral surface is where we represent the motion of objects. And again, in this blue area, it's not simply the motion of any object, but it's the rigid, unarticulated motion associated with tools, this stuff, as opposed to this red area, which is called the superior temporal sulcus, where we represent biological motion, that flexible, fully articulated motion that defines the way we move through the world. And finally, up here in what's called the dorsal stream are areas that are responsible for manipulating and grasping, and that's where we store that kind of knowledge. So the whole circuitry is these blue areas that I've laid out for you. Now, how do I make these claims? How do we know this is the case? And we know this is the case because when we put people in fMRI scanners and we have them do tasks, naming, remembering, you name it, with objects like this, well, those areas I just showed you ramp up their activity relative to stuff that looks like this. All right? So they're going to ramp up for the tools, but not objects that look like this, like the animals, or objects that look like this, which is us, people, and even objects that look like this. And this set is particularly important because this is another group of inanimate objects. And it's inanimate objects that we have a lot of kind of motoric experience with, but non-belts and so on. However, the motor behavior that is associated with these kinds of objects has nothing to do with their function. So one of my favorite examples is this 9-volt battery. So we've all had experience manipulating these things, trying to get it into whatever gadget we've got and so on. But that manipulation has nothing to do with the function of the battery. Whereas real tools, the way we manipulate them is directly related to function. And the areas that I just outlined for you, in fact, are responding only to those objects where manipulation is tied to function. That is, tools. Okay, so I also kind of made claims about what all these areas do. Unlike our president-elect, we actually get evidence for what we claim. So let me show you why I make those claims. How do we know that these labels are accurate? Because we can do experiments to kind of piece out what are they doing. So, for example, these areas that I said are motion preferring, in fact, respond more. Not only do they respond more to the tools than to, in this case, human beings, but respond more to moving tools than static pictures. Whereas the biological motion area, of course, respond more to that than static images. Now you might say, well, that's not that interesting because those moving stimuli are much more interesting than the static. However, these ventral areas, the bottom of the brain, that are interested in visual form, it doesn't matter. They respond as much to these moving objects as the static, and the biological areas as much to moving images of people than static images. So those are the form. That's why we say they're form preferring versus the motion preferring. Well, what do these form areas like? Well, they like full images of forms. So let's strip away a lot of the form information, a lot of the color information, and here we now can see a decrement when, for example, these blue areas, again, not only respond more to the tools than the images of people, but respond more to those versions of a moving tool versus, I hope everybody sees that easily as a hammer, where the biological motion areas respond more to that full image versus that thing there. These are called point light stimuli, all right? Whereas, as you can imagine, the motion preferring areas couldn't care less. They just want to respond to moving things and respond equally well to the moving images as the point light images. So that's how we go about, one, defining the areas, where they are, and secondly, defining their function. All right. So if this network is really about supporting our knowledge of tools, then it should kind of come online when we learn about these kinds of objects like Nikki was just showing us. But there's a real problem with doing this. And the problem is that anything you show somebody that even looks like a tool is going to activate this system, because I already showed you in the adult brain, you just show people pictures of tools versus animals, you get this system. So to get around this, what we did was create what we call novel tools, which hopefully none of you would think of as tools. We made 32 of these things, trained people on 16, used the other 16 as controls. They all had moving parts and they all had functions. So here's an example of this kind of weird thing. They pick up an object, put it into this form board. These are your high tech, this is your tax dollars at work right here with making these kinds of things, as opposed to, that's a cardboard box we used, but I think you get the idea. Here's another example. We called this thing the crusher. People would just pick up objects, smash them together, all right? Every one of them had a specific function, and as I showed here, they spent a lot of time learning what to do with them, 2 hours, 3 times over, 10-day period. So as you can imagine, there's the data for them learning. This is the time on task, and over each session, they get faster and faster. Also, during learning, they get better and better at visually recognizing these objects. So here we just simply ask, is that the same object photographed from 2 different views? And they get very strong memory representations, because this is not surprising. They spend a lot of time playing with these things. Okay. Then the question is, what's going on in people's brains after doing all this learning? So we put them in the scanner, and importantly, we're just going to do a simple perceptual test, just like the one I just showed you. You'd see 2 objects like this on the screen, and they had to say, is that the same object from a different view, or is it 2 different objects? And we did that with both the objects they were trained on and the objects they weren't trained on. And here's what happened. This is a single individual. This is now not a cartoon. This is a real person's brain. These red areas now, don't get confused. The red is not the biological stuff. The red is the activation. The red indicates what areas are the neurons ramping up as a function of learning. So during the pre-training, you can't really see it, but it's a little bit of red here, and actually the whole visual system is active, and that's it. This is the visual pathway down here. After training, however, look what happens. The areas that I've just been describing to you, the blue areas, come online when just simply doing a perceptual test with these things that they now have learned are actually tools. And here's the direct comparison of this versus that to get the statistics to say, yeah, these are real changes. So from that, we can assume that the way I like to describe this is that your experience actually is sculpting the cortex. That is, it's changing levels of activity. And again, they're not doing a tool test. They're just looking at this stuff, right? But they know from their learning that these things are tools in the sense that they have functionality. So this experience is sculpting the cortex, but it's not just doing that willy-nilly. It's doing it right within the system. Right within the system, right within the circuitry that I've been describing to you that we use to understand and store information about the common tools that we encounter in our life. Okay. What about these higher order levels of representation? So I'm showing you stuff about, pictures of animals, pictures of tools, but what we're really interested in is these more higher order cognitive domains, like knowledge about our mechanical world and knowledge about our social world. And again, we have the same kind of problem with what kind of stimuli you're going to show, because if you show tools and people, we know you're going to get activation in these networks, because you just have to look at this stuff. So to get around that, we took advantage of an approach that was developed by Fritz Heider and Marianne Simmel back in the 1940s, where they just used simple geometric shapes in motion, which, as hopefully you'll see, will elicit all kinds of higher order or more complicated levels of representation. So you're in the scanner, and I just tell you to look at this, and you're going to tell me what you think it is. And that's not it. Now, Nikki's not going to get this because she's British, but everybody get this idea here? Somebody? Baseball? Oh, you wouldn't know. Simple, yes, no, okay. All right, so compare that to this. So that's the same, stimulus. All of them are the same there. But hopefully you're not seeing that as some little guy running around banging into some big guy. Anybody pinball? I show this at, college-age students. Most of them don't have a clue what this is all about, but that's pinball. All right, you get the idea. So, okay, let's do one more because people like to. This one's a little bit more difficult, so you're going to have to concentrate really hard. Anybody want to take a guess here? So we're going for the concept of sharing. No. Well, hopefully everybody saw that potentially it's something within the domain of an animate kind of story as opposed to inanimate, which as it would look more like this. So that's the ice cream factory. The other thing was that they were sharing ice cream was the idea, and the cone fell off, and everybody get this factory thing? Yes. Okay, that's how we. And as you probably would guess by now, since I'm telling you this story, the same areas that are active when you look at pictures of animals and pictures and tools, the same network becomes active when looking at the mechanical stories versus the animate stuff, the social. So here's our blue areas here. This is that area, and you can see here's the actual activity there, and there's hardly any activity when looking at these social vignettes, ramping up for the mechanical, and the social area is showing the opposite. This is that ventral stream. There was the cartoon I showed you. These are the real data, and we're cutting the brain right like that. So these are the ventral form areas, and these are the motion areas. It's the same story. Okay, since I started with the patients, and I mentioned to you, and it's almost done, that there were very few of these patients that seemed to have category-specific disorders for tools. Since we and many other laboratories have been doing this work, turns out that there have been many more patients that have been studied and found. Here's just one example. Now, this is not, these are lesion maps. This is based on 131 patients, showing you these areas in color of where the damage was. The claim is that not that there was 131 patients who had disorders with knowing about tools specifically, but that when they did, the lesions were in these areas, which fit very nicely with our data for actually, in this case, looking at tools versus animals. And in fact, there's been recently over 5 laboratories, over 445 patients tested, all showing that when you get these disorders, you get damage to the areas that I've been describing to you. Okay, so here's your summary. The brain contains a distinct neurocircuitry, and that's what I've been showing you, dedicated to the domain of tools. The nodes, or the areas in those circuits, represent the most salient properties of those objects: form, motion, manipulation, so on. And that this circuit comes on automatically and obligatorily in support of perceiving and knowing and using these objects that we call tools. One last point, since I've been talking about tool knowledge. Well, what about everything else? I mean, we know more stuff about tools than I've been talking about here. For example, many of us, probably all of us, know that there are these kind of different names, right, that we have for tools. Sledgehammers, ball peen, jackhammers. That stuff is in your brain somewhere. This is a piece of knowledge that maybe some of you know, that in the Middle Ages, hammers were used in blacksmith guild logos. Some of us know that Maxwell had a silver one in that Beatles song. And finally, I'm sure everybody in this room knows that the amount of energy delivered to the target of a hammer blow is equivalent to 1/2 the mass of the head times the square of the head speed at the time of impact. Somebody knows this because I found it in Wikipedia. My only point is we can have all kinds of knowledge about these objects that we haven't touched on at all, but needs to be accounted for and stored somewhere in our brains. So the final point I want to leave you all with, which is critical, what I've been talking about, I consider kind of a foundation or a scaffolding. It's this notion, this image of these kind of support structures. And what we support is our conceptual system, our verbal store of knowledge, which you call encyclopedic or associative knowledge, which we simply assume is stored elsewhere. Let me just show you all the people over the years, because it's been a long kind of ongoing part of what I do in my lab, especially the people that I kind of highlighted in red here. Who did some of the work I just showed you. So I've got to thank them, and thank you all for listening.